Here we go. Let us get started then for this evening. Welcome everyone again, and thank you for joining us. We are continuing on our study of the book of Revelation. We're still busy with the church of Thyatira. Last week we looked at Revelation 2 verse 18 there, and I spent a lot of time looking at tiered symbolism, which probably creates the idea that it's a hierarchy, which may not have been the best expression on my side. Let's think of it rather as depth, continuing depth of meaning as we go deeper and deeper. But irrespective of that, we're going to move on this evening to verses 19, 20, and maybe 21, and just look now at the contextual, or the context, I should say, behind Jezebel, behind the church of Thyatira, and what was most likely happening here. So last week we looked at the introduction here, where Jesus introduces himself as the Son of God, the one who has eyes like flame of fire and feet like burnished bronze. And now we are starting with the actual message that he has given to the church. And verses 19 and 20 read as follows. You can just follow with me again there, top left-hand corner from the NASB. I know your deeds and your love and faith and service and perseverance, and that your deeds of late are greater than at first. But I have this against you, that you tolerate the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and she teaches and leads my bondservants astray, so that they commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. All right, so let's jump straight in and look at the context of all of that. Starting here from the top here, I know your deeds, your love and faith and service and perseverance. Four things that are mentioned there by the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, Mounce in his commentary argues, and he's not the only one, there are a couple of people that do argue this logic, that the four items that are mentioned here are built along the following construction: that love and faithfulness love and faith or faithfulness provide the motive forces, if you want, or sorry, love and service, I should say, that's the faithfulness one there, provide the motive forces behind this, and faith and endurance are the resulting actions from this. It's a neat little duality. I just don't know if there's anything within the syntax that would suggest that we have to read it this way. And what I just want to point out again is how this is structured in the Greek. It says, I know your deeds. So it will go ta erga. Let's see if I can find it here in the Greek for you. Where are we? There we go. Okay, so it says ta erga ke tin agapin, ke tin pistin, ke tin diakonian, ke tin ipomonin. So we have here the list of four, and you can see there that it's always a ke, a and conjunction that joins them. But in the Greek, it's most likely that this first conjunction, or that this first one in the list, your works here, let me highlight that in green for us, is actually functioning exegetically, which means that it is everything that follows is a case example of it. So you would say, if you were translating this less literally and more figuratively into English, we would probably say something like, I know of your deeds, namely your love and faith and service and perseverance. So the four things that are mentioned afterwards are the deeds that Jesus is referring to. It's not that deeds is one of this chain of nouns that carries on. Why this is important for me, and the only reason why I'm really highlighting this, is again, this is not about deeds in the sense of what works must I do to have salvation. That's not the concept behind this. The deeds here stem from, if you follow Mounce's logic, your love and your service, your faithfulness as your motivating forces, and they result in perseverance, right? In you doing things for the Lord. Again, the reason why I struggle with this is because you can have love for God, which is poured out as love for your fellow man. So, at what point is it a motivating force, and at what point is it an actual action? Because Scripture reveals to us that love is not just a motivating driving force, but it's also an action that we partake. So all of these deeds are kind of framed around the idea of faithful witness. That's the key factor that holds all of this together. So Beale notes, for example, in his commentary that love, faith, and endurance, that those three particular terms are associated elsewhere in the book of Revelation itself with the notion of persevering witness. And that obviously is this last one here. So quite often this concept of perseverance or persevering witness is accompanied by one or two or three of these other terms. This is not the only instance in the book where we have this. And a couple of examples just to go back and to show you, because you'll see that one or two of these are going to become very relevant to us this evening. In the message to the church of Ephesus, Jesus says the following: "But I have this against you, that you have left your first love." Okay, so the idea of abandonment or having left as the antithesis or the opposite of being faithful and enduring. So we've got that concept again, albeit by slightly different construct. Then we have in 2:10, in the message to another church here, we see, "Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison so that you will be tested, and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful unto death." So there again, we have this concept of faithfulness, this enduring witness of the saints that is required, right? And we'll see this again a little bit later, but let me just jump ahead to 3 verse 10 here. A message to another church says, "Because you have kept my word of perseverance," note there, "I also will keep you from the hour of testing, that hour which is about to come upon the whole world." All right, so that's and I think let me take this to chapter 14, and I'm going to go to verse 12 here quickly. Now this is no longer part of the message to the churches, right? What is being described here is part of of John's vision. But he says an interesting thing here. He says, "Here is the perseverance of the saints who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus." Note that there's a distinction between the two, right? They're very closely related, but they're not perfectly co-identical. Otherwise, this would be a redundant statement again. So what we have here is that within this framework of what we see here in chapter 14, this is obviously a vision that incorporates the global church and what the global church has been going through. But there is this idea again that just as certain churches in the letters were required to endure in their faith, that same pattern repeats throughout the book of Revelation for all the faithful who are in the church of God. So we see this continued pattern, right? So if I take it back, let's go back to where we were, Revelation 2:19. So the idea here is that those who are faithful, obviously, or who do faithful service, are the ones who bear public witness to God in the face of conflict. This persevering witness, this idea of it, is an overarching theme throughout the book of Revelation. It's very important, but I don't want you to limit that idea just to evangelism. This is not just, it's part of it, and it's a very important part of it, but it's not the only aspect of it, despite what one or two commentators may suggest through their analysis. Witness can be in many forms and should be in many forms, and that's why there is this idea of endurance as well, because that is staying firm to what you believe in the face of cultural opposition. Then you are not necessarily evangelizing, but you are still standing up for the truth of the gospel and the gospel message, and that in itself is a witness. So there is a broader concept of witness here in terms of their love for one another, their compassion towards the poor, towards others, their love and fidelity to Christ during their worship services. All of those can constitute part of our Christian witness. And I think we need to keep that in mind in the general sense. So what is interesting here grammatically is that the noun agape, right? This word agape that means love, only occurs twice in the book of Revelation in its noun form. And one of them is here in verse 19, and the other one is all the way back into verse 4, where he says to the church in Ephesus, as we just read, you have lost your first love. Now, I find this interesting. It might just be a grammatical anomaly, but it does bring to my mind a very interesting contrast that I want to point out here, because it's almost as if the church of Ephesus and the church of Thyatira here work as in the inverse of one another, by which I mean the following. Let me just read this for you quickly. That while the love of the Ephesian church had begun to decrease in 2 verse 4, we see that the practical expression of love in Thyatira had grown, right? He said, the Lord says to them, you are now doing more than you did at first. So the one is excelling in love, whereas the other had begun to grow cold. They had decreased in their love. Now that's the noun form. The actual verb form, agapao, right, is only used to express divine love in the book of Revelation. That's an interesting one. It is never, it's never in the context of love for one's fellow man or anything like this. It is always in the sense of a love for Christ, for God. And the only exception to that, and there's not really an exception, but by syntax it is sort of, is Revelation 12 verse 11. And I think we should just go there quickly, because again, it'll help us just to get a bit of background and a bit of context of what's going on here. And they overcame him, these are the saints, they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. And they did not love, there's your verb, agapao, their life, even when faced with death. So again, we have this enduring witness, the word of testimony of the gospel, and probably their personal testimony of what Christ had done for them, but they did not love their own life. So in other words, in this verse here, we see that this idea of divine love is actually kept whole within the book of Revelation, that there is no love greater than, or not supposed to be any love greater than the love that we have for God. And that kind of, I hope, frames everything for you in terms of what the Lord compliments the church of Thyatira for. Now, with this letter, of course, he does, as we've observed in the past few weeks, what he does with some of the other churches, that there is the compliment before there is the rebuke and the criticism of what needs to be changed. And after that follows the word of warning, of course. So if we look at this, the message to the church, where he starts to be critical, he says here in verse 20, but I have this against you, that you tolerate the woman Jezebel. Okay, now note here, who calls herself a prophetess, she teaches and leads my bondservants astray. So we spoke about this 2 weeks ago. This is a false authority. Remember, I said that all the symbolism of Jesus Christ coming is to come as a judge who has the divine authority to judge. And he stands in the position of true authority. And he is now speaking against this woman Jezebel, who calls herself, she was not anointed by him, otherwise he would have said that. She calls herself a prophetess. And she is doing false teaching. And through that false teaching, she is getting some of the church to connect sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols. So in this regard, again, note here this idea of false teaching. We have again this inversion that we had between Ephesus and Thyatira, right? Ephesus was commended because they tested the apostles. They tested the message. They were doctrinally secure, right? Thyatira, on the other hand, is rebuked because they did not do this, right? They failed to do what Ephesus had done, and they did not prevent false teaching from entering their midst. So how does this contrast play out? Let me just explain this for us carefully again, so that we have a point of reference. In Ephesus, we had doctrinal vigilance without love. Okay, and in Thyatira we have love and service, but without doctrinal vigilance. So what is the result? Well, in Ephesus, doctrinal vigilance without love results in a church that is correct, but it is dying covenantally. That was the big risk for Ephesus. In Thyatira, we have a church that is full of love and is serving, but it doesn't have this doctrinal vigilance. What happens is there's the potential that this church can become covenantally compromised. And that's exactly what's happened. So what it shows us, just as a little bit of a pastoral aside here, is that we cannot separate doctrine from practice. Practice without true doctrine becomes deception, and doctrine without faithful practice becomes death. That to me is what the contrast between these two churches signifies the most. So let me repeat that again for you. Practice without true doctrine becomes deception, and doctrine without faithful practice becomes death. And that's the important thing. So what a lot of commentators suggest here, because remember, we are far removed from this context. I didn't live in this time. I didn't live in the city. I was not part of this church. So I don't know exactly what was going on here. But what a lot of commentators suggest is that Jezebel taught in general a form of idolatry or false worship within the church. Obviously taken from this latter section of having eaten or having convinced them to eat things sacrificed to idols. And this idea is strengthened. I understand where they get this from. It's strengthened by Revelation's ongoing reference to idolatry itself via the metaphor of fornication. So there is a symbolic overlap between the idea of fornication and being unfaithful to the covenant God, so that throughout the book we see that there is this overlap of ideas where you engaging in idolatry, whether it be worshipping the beast or worshipping the harlot or whatever it is throughout the book of Revelation, is equated with a type of spiritual fornication. And that's why a lot of people in their commentaries just kind of generalize it into that pattern of false idol worship that was being introduced into the church of Thyatira. I would try to be a little bit more specific here, and I think that we can make a clear case for what might actually have been being taught in this church. So let's look at this carefully. I'm going to try and pull it apart and see if we can get to some kind of conclusion of what was most likely going on here. And when I say that, I'm just going to preface this again, that you understand we don't know absolutely. None of us were there that we could say, oh yes, this must have been the case. All I can do is piece together what I know about the context, what I know from scripture, and put it together in a way that to me makes the most sense and suggest this as a pattern for you. So we see here in 2 verse 20, again, let's just repeat here, that she calls herself a prophetess and she teaches and leads the bond servants astray. Okay. So that, and there are two outcomes here, and this is what I need to highlight here. They commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. Okay, so the first one, sexual immorality, is obviously encompassed by this term porneia in the Greek. The second one by idolotheta, which is this idea that you are partaking of food that was actually dedicated to another god through idol worship. So my key point is that what Jesus is presenting here is not a political critique, nor is it a cultural complaint. What he is presenting them with is a covenantally charged, or he's basically saying that they have compromised their covenant. And this is the significant thing. So if we look at the syntax here, and this is where we need to sometimes look at language carefully. I know that I can delve into it, very deeply from time to time, and I try to avoid doing it all the time. But I think in this case, it'll help us again just to elucidate a little bit of what Jesus may have been trying to communicate here. Note that we have sexual immorality as one action, and we have eating things sacrificed to idols as a second action, right? So why I why I point this out is that it is unlikely that both acts, that both sexual immorality, porneia, fornication, and the eating of food sacrificed to idols would refer to exactly the same sin. And why I say that this is unlikely is, if porneia had been a metaphor for idolatry only, then it would mean that we have two phrases that symbolize the same thing. And this idea of spiritual idolatry then becomes redundant. Why do we have to say it twice in two different ways? So my conclusion is that the most natural reading of what Jesus is saying to the church here is that we must take porneia as literal sexual immorality, that they were actually engaging in fornication of some sort, most likely with prostitutes, and again we'll get to that just now, and that we should take eating food sacrificed to idols quite literally as their participation in idol feasts, and both together symbolize the kind of covenant unfaithfulness that is embodied in idolatry. So this is a both and logic. I'm not saying it must be either or. And again, here I'm going to try and clarify my point here. I'm not saying that fornication here can't mean spiritual idolatry. All I'm saying is that it definitely doesn't exclude the literal physical immorality that may have been occurring as well. So we know that throughout the Bible, idolatry is tantamount to spiritual adultery. But, and this is the thing that I need us to focus on tonight, is that spiritual adultery often expresses itself through literal practices, especially those in cultic settings. And sometimes part of that may have been the physical immorality as well. So I'm not choosing here between literal fornication and spiritual idolatry. What I'm saying is that literal immorality is functioning as covenant idolatry, that it's not just about sleeping with prostitutes, but it is sleeping with prostitutes in the kind of social situation that makes it idolatrous. So let's explain to you the cultural situation of what could have been happening in Thyatira and give you some context here so that hopefully this begins to make sense. And I have alluded to it in the past couple of weeks, and I definitely mentioned it when we were looking at Smyrna, but I think this is a good point to just elaborate a bit on the historical context so that you guys can understand the social reality that would have been facing a church like this and why it would have been so tempting for people to engage in this kind of immorality. So the broad context is, for those of you who don't know the history, that the city of Thyatira had been established as a Macedonian colony by Alexander the Great after the destruction of the Persian Empire. Okay, it was located in a rich agricultural area. The city was famous for its manufacture of purple dye specifically, and there are numerous references that we have throughout secular literature of the time, and there are even some allusions to it throughout the New Testament, that we know that the city was heavily involved in the dye business, and that the trade guilds would have been a predominant thing in the city, especially trade guilds associated with the manufacturing of cloth. So that's the broad background. Now, what I want to do in the middle panel here, I'm just going to open up an excerpt for us. This is from the author Richard Ascoth, and this is Paul and Associations. It's a small section in a much larger book called Paul in the Greco-Roman World, a handbook for any of you who want to go and research this on your own time. Very valuable resource in terms of looking at the broader socio-historical context in which the New Testament scriptures are written. But I just want to give you this bit so that you can hopefully understand how significant trade guilds would have been in a city like Smyrna and in a city like Thyatira. So let's just read here in the middle, and hopefully it's not so small that you struggle, but I'm going to read it aloud anyway, and you could just follow along with me. The author says here that such occupational guilds had very little economic power. In the few instances in which any group attempted to invoke action that was perceived as political, the action was quickly quelled, as with the case of the threat of the bakers' strike at Ephesus around 200 CE. Thus, the primary function of occupational guilds was social. For example, banqueting. And I've highlighted that sentence for you because it's very important. Individuals within these guilds would have accrued many benefits through the trust network, right? Not that different from the kind of business networking we have today, except for some of the social ramifications. So the trust network that the group engendered would have given them benefits, including reduced transactional costs, increased contract enforceability, and the lessening of risks and uncertainties involved in endeavors. Such benefits likely played a large part in the attractiveness of belonging to such an occupational association. So some groups were constituted with a particular purpose in mind, most often, and again I've highlighted this for you, of a social nature such as banqueting or drinking, as in the case of an association comprised of 38 fellow banqueters. And then he gives a long example. We're not going to worry about that. Let's just skip down to where I've highlighted here in red again. The author says, such groups most likely included some cult practice in their gatherings and may have been formed by persons in a particular neighborhood or from a single occupation. Yet they chose to self-identify publicly through their inscriptions with a particular type of social activity. Almost all associations were involved in the worship of a deity or a set of deities. And this is the most important thing for us to note. So although some groups made this their primary focus and thus can be categorized as a cult or a group of or groups or initiate associations, this is perhaps most obviously the case of associations dedicated to Dionysus, and those members initiated into the mystery cults. And then he mentions a couple of other points. So what is the key thing that we need to take away from the description that the author has given us? Firstly, that guilds were social trust networks. They were not primarily political unions. Secondly, that their central activity was quite often banqueting itself, and that most associations were tied to the worship of a patron deity. So for many Christians, if they were involved in guild life, it was not merely a work association. It was the social world that would have protected their livelihood, reputation, and belonging, and it may have required them to partake of guild meals, these social banquets that are being referred to here. And if you can remember what we discussed about the Corinthian context, it may well be that a similar kind of idea had been happening within the city of Corinth and had also caused distress amongst the community here, that there were people who were now being pulled towards a guild that could protect them economically and socially speaking, but it required them to do what? It required them to actively engage in eating food that was sacrificed to idols. And as part of this revelry within the social matrix of the day, it would have been common for hosts to provide other forms of entertainment as well. And this is where prostitutes may have come in for the guild members to enjoy themselves with while they were at the banquet. So that what happens is that we have the eating of food and the engagement in sexual immorality, both within the context of idolatry. And that's the important thing that we need to get. It's the clearest example that I can give you of what could likely have been happening. So whereas the church's doctrine is quite clear on this, and you can read what Paul says to the Corinthians, is yes, your mindset has been, well, an idol is nothing, therefore I can partake of this, I can do with it whatever I want, and the body means nothing, so what does it matter who I sleep with? And I'm of a higher spiritual reality than all of these fleshly lower things. So what damage does it do if I partake in this kind of guild meal? And Paul, if you read through the book of Corinthians, he addresses this quite severely at a number of places and via a number of different arguments. The point is that the Lord himself would see such a thing as idolatrous. Because why? Because you are putting your trust in the patron guild deity. And then you are engaging in worship of that deity through what you eat and through your sexual immorality. And that is how I believe it's fitting that we could say that it could be a literal physical act, which also then spiritually becomes an act of idolatrous worship. So the threat that the people in Thyatira would have had, if I could put it this way, your job and your social survival may have depended on guild membership, right? The guild membership depended on shared meals, and those meals involved devotion to idols. So what do? This is the question that the Corinthians had to answer. This is most likely the same question that was facing the church in Thyatira. The threat was not persecution by lions per se, but it was economic and social exclusion through compromise. And that's exactly the same language that we saw come up in Smyrna as well, where there were economic effects because of their unwillingness to participate in this. So, having said that, what I suspect was happening in this church in Thyatira is that this Jezebel figure, right, was introducing under the authority of prophetic word. In other words, I'm saying this to you with the authority of Christ himself, right? I am acting as his messenger in this. There was a false teacher or a group of false teachers who were teaching this idea that it was permitted and that it was okay for you to engage in this kind of guild practice. I can't prove this, absolutely. Like I said, there's no way that I can go back in time and see exactly what was happening here. But given what we know about Greco-Roman culture, this seems to me to be the most likely. So what is the teaching? Probably one of the same kind of thing that you heard in Corinth. An idol is nothing, your body is nothing, just go and partake of it so that you can be economically blessed and everything else, because you know that the reality of who God is greater than what is going out there. And this is a false teaching that comes in, because to God this is not a simple matter of, well, my headspace is above this. This is an issue of I am worshiping something other than God. And that's why this thing has to be addressed. So when teachings like this or other false doctrines came in at Ephesus, they were discarded as being doctrinally false, as being false teachings. But Thyatira had, through the involvement of some teacher or group of teachers, gotten to the place where a portion or all of the church were accepting this as being okay. And that's why the Lord needed to address this and say, no, you don't have permission to do these kind of things, because they are tantamount to idolatrous behavior. So tying this back to the archetype of Jezebel, and I spent a week on this topic, so I don't want to overreach again. I don't want to go through all of that again, but let us keep it restrained. In the Old Testament, the character of Jezebel, she represented a seduction into Baal worship or Baal practice. And again, Baal practice actually included both idolatry in the very literal sense and sexual immorality. Both of those aspects would have been there. So the name Jezebel most likely functions as a prophetic label. Why I'm saying that, I don't know. It could be that there was quite literally a woman in the church called Jezebel, but we don't know for certain. It could have been a teacher, it could have, of either gender, it could have been a group of teachers, But whatever it is and however it came in, the teaching is identified as being perpetrated by this archetype of a Jezebel-like figure. So what is Jesus doing? He's comparing the false teaching that is going on there with the kind of false worship and idolatry that was happening in Israel during the time of Jezebel. And noticing that this is not merely a case of bad behavior, but as I said, this is covenantal seduction, if you want to term it that way. So remember that when we talk about symbols in the book of Revelation, a symbol can be real without necessarily being limitless. Okay, so I've taught you to think in layers, and I've taught you to keep the symbolism as close to its intention as possible without making leaps. So Jezebel here is not Babylon in miniature. She is not the total symbol of a worldwide economy. It's a very specific teaching that is being addressed in this community. And the context here is very much intra-church. It is disciplinary. It is situational. When we get to the Whore of Babylon in chapter 17 or roundabout there, you'll see that that is a global system. That is a symbol for a global system of economy and worship of economy and these kind of things that impacts the entire world, not the church per se, because the church is called to come out of that. So I can see that there are typological overlaps, but we cannot equate the two one to another. So the best is, like I said, to define Jezebel, the name Jezebel, as a metaphor. So let me put it this way. The name Jezebel could function like a prophetic nickname. It identifies the kind of influence that is at work, the seduction into covenantal compromise. It doesn't indicate the full eschatological system that we see in Revelation chapter 17. So it is a type of one part of the system of symbols, but it is not the totality of it. And again, I'm just going to emphasize this so that we get this. Whether Jezebel was a single woman, a male teacher under a symbolic label, or a group of leaders is of secondary importance. The text's emphasis is not on her or their biography per se. Rather, it is on the function of Jezebel, that she teaches compromise and that the church tolerates it. That's the important thing that we need to get to. So the theological point here, what is Christ doing? He is not merely forbidding these naughty things. He is defending the church as a holy people in exactly the same language as Paul uses in Corinth to address them and to say, you are the holy temple of God. Treat yourself accordingly, right? That same kind of language would most likely be appropriate in this situation, right? That the church of Thyatira should understand itself as a group of holy people distinct from the worship system of the world, not permitted to re-enter it through some kind of higher knowledge or understanding. So let's put this whole thesis together. Let me summarize this for us again. Jezebel's teaching most likely authorized Christians to remain embedded in guild-based banqueting and cultic life, treating these idol feasts and sexual immoralities as harmless social participation, which Christ, however, identifies as covenantal adultery. So that's just what I wanted to point out for you. And I think it's interesting, just from a pastoral perspective, how Thyatira compares with Ephesus, for example, that we can see that pure doctrine without love or pure deeds without doctrine can never work. We have to have both in place. Otherwise, the church will be compromised. So it's an interesting parallel that we can make between the two. Now, I'm going to leave it there. It's just 2 verses for this evening, but I hope that this has given you enough of a foundation to understand what was the most likely situation for what could have been happening within the church of Thyatira. So I wish you all a wonderful evening. Have a great week further, and God willing, we'll see you all next week as we carry on with studying the book of Revelation.